Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed, Conversations on Teaching and Learning. I'm Andrew Everett. This podcast is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University. We release new episodes the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semesters. Please take a moment to rate, review, subscribe, and share this podcast. This episode is a little bit different. I'm joined by my colleagues, Jeff Mastromonico and Arthur Takahashi. If you want to learn more about us, go ahead and visit our show page, augusta.edu/innovation. Our topic today is gamification and game-based learning strategies in higher ed. So, to get started, let's define gamification and game-based learning. Jeff, what is gamification?
Well, gamification is defined as the use of game design elements in a non-game context. So adding those elements of playing games to a non-game context like your coursework, a lot of times it does get confused with game-based learning, which is the use of actual games. So whether you're talking about a digital game or a board game, but that's the core component of the educational experience. So the key difference is that game-based learning, it integrates the game itself as a central part of the learning tool, but gamification uses those game-like elements, but it does not rely on the game itself to deliver the content.
So game-based learning by playing a game. Gamification makes learning feel more like a game.
Right.
All right. So now we've established those definitions. How does gamification impact student motivation and engagement, or how have you seen that? Arthur?
Yeah, so I can speak from my own experience teaching a public speaking course. So in comparing last semester with this semester, when I had a guest speaker in my course, last semester, I had students asking only 2 or 3 questions. So there was not a lot of interaction. But this semester, what I decided to do was to implement a game element into that interaction with the guest speaker. And what I did was I brought a mystery bag and I had some goodies inside the bag, some edible, some not. And what I told students was, if you ask questions after the guest speaker talks, then you can pull something from this mystery bag. And what ended up happening was we had about 20 minutes of great questions, and students almost emptied that bag. So, examples like this really show me that when we introduce game-like elements into our courses, we can increase engagement and motivation.
Jeff, anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that gamification is a student-centered method of design. So you are, like Arthur said, taking those elements of games that we find fun and we find engaging, but you're designing them based on knowing your students, because different things motivate different people. And so, getting an understanding of your student and being able to then take those game elements and make things more challenging, mechanics like working together in groups for those that are more into the social aspect of games. Things like chance and are really can make content more engaging.
So how has gamification evolved in higher education over the past few years? It's a relatively new approach to traditional education. Jeff?
Well, I do think there's been a lot more research that is being done on gamification to understand its efficacy. So because of that, I think we have a deeper understanding of how game mechanics actually can enhance and engage. And so, it can be used in different learning environments. Gamification is now seen more as a more holistic approach, I think, to enhancing learning rather than just a motivational tool. So there are a lot of extrinsic motivators that you can have when you're using gamification in your coursework, things like badges, rewards, or points. But there's a shift now, I think, to the more intrinsic motivators that are a part of gamification. So a lot more meaningful learning activities. So where there's a focus on things like autonomy and competence and mastery over things. And so there's a progression that's tied to learning milestones for students as opposed to just the accumulation of points.
Anything to add, Arthur?
Yeah, so when it comes to research on gamification, game-based learning, we know from meta-analysis of other studies on game-based learning specifically, and more specifically even to computer-based games, we do need more research on that. right? But the little bit that's out there already, what they show is that there is a small increase in student learning when compared to more traditional forms of lecturing or of teaching, and there might be as well a little bit of an increase in motivation there. But again, we need more research in this field. Now, what I would say is that, one of the authors that I love to read is Richard Mayer. And one of the things that he says is that research that compares computer-based games for learning, and then more traditional forms of learning. That's known in his research as media comparison studies. And Mayer is not a really big fan of that. And the reason for that is because that kind of research is more technology-centered instead of being more learner-centered, because they start from the standpoint of, what kind of technologies are more effective for learning. And if you take a look at the history of technology in education, according to Mayer, if we start from that standpoint, right? Thomas Edison, when motion picture came into the scene, he argued that motion pictures were going to revolutionize education. Well, that really didn't happen. Then the same argument was made for radio, that radio was going to be in every single classroom around the world. Well, that also didn't happen. The same thing with TV, and even with the internet. People thought that the internet and internet-based learning, online learning, was going to be better than traditional learning. And what we see from research is that that is not true. What is true is that a well-designed course based on how students actually learn, that is effective, regardless of technology. So chances are that once the research on gamification matures a little bit more, if what Richard Mayer argues pans out, is that, there's not really going to be a difference between game-based learning and more traditional forms of learning. So what we really need to think about is how, if we implement gamification in our courses, we need to think about how that can aid student learning based on what we know of how learning actually works. Right, so that would be a more learner-centered approach. And Richard Mayer has done some research on, what he calls value-added research. So basically, if you compare, implementing a game into a course, and then implementing that same game but making a small change to it, does that small change, that added value, actually impacts learning? And what he has seen, he has come up. Again, initial findings, right? But he has come up with basically 5 principles that have worked if you decide to implement a game into your course, a computer-based game. There are 5 principles that you can use that will make that game more effective. So one of them is the coaching principle. And that means that after students select something into that game, they receive immediate feedback. Right. So why the choice was right or perhaps wrong, and the consequences of that. So that would be the coaching principle. And we know from Mayer's research that if you implement that coaching, that feedback, learning will be enhanced. Right. Another one is the self-explanation principle. So if students, before they select something in that game, if they explain, why they're making that choice, right, in the form of perhaps clicking on the reason why, between like 2 or 3 different reasons why they're choosing that specific, making that specific choice, that learning is also enhanced. And the other 3 principles really come from Richard Mayer's multimedia learning research. So one of them is the pre-training. If you provide students with information about the concepts in that game before they play the game, they learn better. And pre-training could also be a little bit on the mechanics of the game itself. Another one is the modality principle. So if in that game you present the words via spoken words instead of written words, students will also learn better. And finally, the personalization principle. So if we use in those games, if we use more polite language and use first and second person, so we or you, right, or I or you, then students will learn better as opposed to using third person. So we know that those 5 principles, based on Mayer's research, if we are going to implement a computer-based game, if we use some of those principles into the game, students will learn better. And that's what Mayer calls the value-added research. Again, coming from the standpoint of the learner-centered approach.
Well, let's get into some examples. So what are some examples where gamification or game-based learning has led to improved learning outcomes on a project that you've worked on or that we've worked on? Jeff?
Well, we've had the opportunity to work with a lot of faculty on different gamification projects. I know one that comes to mind was a world literature simulation that we worked with Dr. Christina Heckman on. The goal was to teach students how to read texts for clarity and recall knowledge and to put things into cultural context. So we created this game where they navigated around an ancient land that they were stuck in, and they had to read passages of ancient Hebrew literature and then solve puzzles based on what they had read in order to earn rewards to finally get back home from the ancient land. And student surveys showed that they found this was a much more engaging way to connect with the content. Another example, we created a live escape room experience when we worked with Allied Health as a part of their interprofessional education day, with the goal of teaching these different disciplines how to work together and about patient-centered care. And I think it's important to talk about how, we're adding these elements of fun and engagement to instruction, but reflection and assessment are kind of where it shows where learning has happened. And so as a part of this escape room experience, there was a reflection, for some of those students that maybe did not escape in the time that we had given them to get out. Why? Did they concentrate more on patient numbers as opposed to more of the patient-centered care that they were supposed to be looking at? Did they not listen to each other and learn to work as a team? So having that reflection as a part of that experience is very important. And those are some of the projects that come to mind.
Arthur, anything you want to share about the escape room or other projects?
I mean, the escape room was a very interesting and very interesting project, just because we were able to help impact students from different fields, and a lot of students. I mean, I think the first time that we facilitated the escape room, how many students did we have?
It was about 150.
Yeah, and I think that trend kind of continued, about 100 students every time that we helped them out with this project. So it is very fulfilling when we see the work that we put into making learning more fun, more engaging, and actually seeing students engaged with the content. So, I have nothing to add other than this. That was just very fulfilling to see that pan out.
I think it was very effective.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It was a fun project to put together, and it took us a few months. And that is a larger project because we were running 6 rooms at one time, and we did 3 rounds of 6 rooms with students in each room. And it took a lot of staff to do it. But if someone wants to do that on a small scale in just their own classroom, what are some elements we could think about or they could consider to put together a small scale escape room?
Well, I think, again, going back to those definitions that we talked about at the beginning, the examples that we just gave were probably examples of game-based learning, where you are talking about, I guess what you'd say is a full-blown game where the end result is the learning hopefully has occurred or the assessment has occurred at the end of the game. But gamification would be maybe just taking a few of those elements. If you start breaking down that escape room and looking at the mechanics, they worked in teams. There was the element of time that kind of add a little bit of fun. There was clues, puzzles, things like that. Any one of those elements could be taken out and just incorporated into a lesson, again, to increase the engagement. A lot of times you want to make sure that you design that based on what you know about your students. If you have the ability to maybe even poll your students at what they like about games. Some people do like working in groups. Some people don't. Some people like autonomy and to being able to work on their own. Some people like puzzles. Some people, that's not what they find fun about games. So being able to design that way. But I think that's one of the challenges that that faculty might encounter with incorporating gamification is that they think it needs to be this full-blown game-based learning or something that's extravagant like what we're talking about now, as opposed to just incorporating some of those fun, engaging elements into their coursework. They can start small, start simple, but it can still be effective.
Mm-hmm. And Arthur, before we move on, I want you to talk about the boosters that you're using in your course.
Yeah, so this would be an example of using game-like elements in a course, so gamification, not game-based learning. But one thing that I decided to do this semester, if students in my public speaking course, if they go to the Center for Writing Excellence for a specific speech, then they get a 10% booster on their final grade for that specific speech. So let's say, if they get an 80 for the speech and they go to the writing center to get help with that speech, then their final grade will actually be 88, right? I haven't, I just assigned the first speech, so I don't know if that's gonna work or not, but we'll see if students will feel more motivated. They were certainly interested in the booster once I was explaining that, but we'll see if that will motivate them to go and seek assistance from the Center for Writing Excellence.
All right. So even though the research is continuing to evolve on gamification and game-based learning, just try something out is kind of the idea. Try it out and see if it works for you and for your students.
Yeah, and if you think about gamification, it's implementing one thing, one item, one game-like element into your course. And then, that would be interesting to see because I'm not familiar with research on gamification, more so on game-based learning. But, if you take Mayer's approach of learner-centered approach and the value-added research, right, it'll be interesting to see if implementing one item from games into your course as opposed to not doing so, if that actually does enhance motivation or learning. And I can tell you for sure that, anecdotal evidence, right, in my course, that there was a big difference in bringing that mystery bag into this guest lecture, if you will, right? As opposed to not bringing it. Like students were definitely more engaged. Obviously, it was not a controlled study or anything like that. It was just my experience, right? But I have seen anecdotal evidence of that.
Sometimes it's just about the practical things. So, Jeff, you mentioned some of the challenges, but let's hit on the challenges a little more. Challenges and limitations of implementing gamification in higher ed.
Well, again, it depends about the implementation, and to touch again on what Arthur was talking about adding maybe one element at a time, because time is one of those challenges. If you are talking about something that's more game-based learning or something that's more extreme, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it, some of the examples that we used, time can definitely be something to consider. We're working right now on a project where there may be a card game that teaches students more about biology terms and phylum and things, but that's going to involve time from the faculty member in order to be able to even implement it in a class. Resources can be a hindrance or a challenge for sure. Again, depending on your implementation, something like what we were talking about before was pretty resource intensive. But something as simple as creating a badging system. There are studies that have shown, I think, in nursing, where they were teaching nursing proficiencies, that using something as simple as just digital badges that they created, as long as they're tied into specific criteria and learning objectives, they really can promote mastery over performance. We talked about those intrinsic motivators before. So that's something that's simple, that's not very resource intensive. And again, to get back to having an understanding of game elements and what gamification is, I think a lot of people shy away from using gamification in their courses because they think it is this complex thing and don't understand that if they wanted to gamify something, it could be as simple as just using teams and groups and things like that into their coursework, and that's a game element. I think there's a lot of things, a lot of game elements that we don't really even realize are elements and things that we like about games.
Or even, badges for accomplishments. You can start small and then go from there.
Right. Again, as long as they are tied and we may talk more about like what goes into designing and developing, but as long as they are tied into specific criteria and learning objectives, the badges on their own don't mean anything unless they are tied to some kind of proficiency or something that they've earned.
And modality can be a challenge too, because face-to-face, you can obviously in face-to-face courses, you could do a little bit more, but it's not impossible to do these, some of these gamification elements to bring them into an online course. You mentioned badging. If your LMS that you're using, like we use D2L, may allow you to actually award a badge to students that they can collect. So while that is kind of a challenge, but the modality, there's things that can be done, right?
There are things that can be done. And matter of fact, we have a whole unit of CII in our learning information specialists who can help you implement a badging system into your courses if that's something that you want to do. And that's an easy way, almost like a hands-off way once it's all set up for badges to be awarded, for whatever the criteria is. And that, again, can be a good and engaging way to motivate students and change their behaviors.
Yeah, and one example too is from the course that we designed together, U.S. or Introduction to American Government, right? We use simulations, right? Text-based simulations with a narrative, right? And so students are into that character and have to make certain decisions, and then we have a discussion, right, around that specific simulation. So even text-based simulations, which shouldn't take as long to create as a full-blown like video simulation or even VR simulation, right? So just text and AI could help us create that as well.
Absolutely, and those simulations in the American government course, the student feedback on those were some of the most liked activities in the course,
and that leads to some good discussion as well.
Absolutely,
from the student. So.
And it's more fun for the instructor too, because they're into it. Then it's more fun to read and listen to their responses. Yep. So we all win, I guess. Yep. So can gamification be successfully implemented across all disciplines? What are your thoughts, Jeff?
I think so. I think again, you need to make sure that your the mechanics that you incorporate match your learning objectives. It can be challenging to make things fun without oversimplifying them. I think the trick is to design the activities to promote deep learning and make the process enjoyable. Again, we're talking about adding game elements to your courses and not necessarily a full-blown game. An escape room is not appropriate for every discipline. But, maybe incorporating badging or leveling up, to show progression, things like ensuring that you have immediate feedback. These are all things that really fall into thoughtful design. Again, I think that there are elements of games that we really don't realize are games. But if we think back to the things that we found fun about games, allowing for more chances in, allowing students to actually fail and try different ways to learn the content or engage with the content. That's like playing a video game where you have three chances, and so each time that you lose a chance, maybe try something a little different in order to succeed. So I think with that kind of mentality, or keeping that in mind, that there are ways that across all kinds of different disciplines with some thoughtful design that you can incorporate fun game elements into your coursework.
And we even have some examples of our own gamification projects with Augusta University faculty, right? So we have projects with professors in communication, history, the medical college. What else, Jeff? Radiotherapy, physical therapy. So we have English and modern languages.
Yeah,
right?
English. So there's been a lot of different disciplines. Arthur mentioned radiation therapy. We created a radiation therapy academy where I think the students were having issues learning navigational nomenclature and navigational vocabulary, and so we developed this academy where they had to learn how to navigate this nanochip that had been put into the body, and how do you find your direction to tumors, and the only way that they could learn to navigate this nano sub was to do it through understanding those navigational terms and things. So, again, something that maybe doesn't sound like it could be part of a game, if you're creative enough and again with thoughtful design that you can and create some engaging game-like elements to teach concepts.
And I think one important thing is what Jeff said, that it has to be tied to a learning objective, right? So it has to be thoughtful design, and that's really borrowing from Mary's argument here. We shouldn't be forcing students to adapt to a game-like situation. It should be the other way around, right? Thinking of how we can adapt game-based learning or games or gamification elements, how we can adapt that to how our students actually learn, right? So it's really the other way around. So, and that's how we would perhaps invite college professors and any educator out there to think about games that way, not how we can just, because gamification is like a thing now, how we can just force that into students. No. Do we have a pedagogical problem in our course that perhaps gamification would be a solution to? So it's really coming from the learner-centered approach here, not the game-centered approach or technology-centered approach.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what are key elements to consider when designing a gamified experience for students? So you mentioned earlier, Jeff, you mentioned some of the mechanics. Let's talk motivators, mechanics, dynamics, those elements.
Yeah, well, I think I had mentioned before that this is a student-centered approach. So when you are, looking to use mechanics, it's having a good understanding of the student. There are different motivators. Not to put people in boxes, but there are people that are achievers, or they're more social. People that are more explorers. And so understanding those personality types in your students, and then being able to pull those game mechanics that match up with those things. But again, making sure that the mechanics reinforce whatever your educational goals are. It's thoughtful design. If the learning isn't happening, then you really, like Arthur said, I think you're just doing gamification for gamification's sake. Let's do something that makes it fun. So I think another thing is having meaningful progression. And so, being able to show whether it be, if you are talking about electronic game, they have progress bars or points and scores or levels that show that you're making a progression in your knowledge and in understanding the content. Having a nice balance. If you think about a game, you don't want something to be too hard or too simple. You kind of want to find that sweet spot as far as balancing challenge and skill. Building in intrinsic motivation. We talked about the extrinsic motivators that are like rewards and badges and things, but maybe making more intrinsic motivators of mastery of the content, more about learning goals as opposed to just earning points. Storytelling is also a really big thing. If you can create an immersive narrative, again, it needs to be contextual. So a story that actually aligns with what the learning goals are. Or the objectives, but a narrative can really go a long way into making the content more immersive and really bringing students in and engaging them.
Anything to add, Arthur?
No, I think Jeff said it. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about technology tools or platforms that might be most effective in supporting gamification within courses. Arthur?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that same argument of, if we start the question that way, then it's more a technology-centered approach. Instead, we really need to think of, how technology can aid into helping our students learn based on how we know that learning works, right? So that's the long answer to your question. The short answer is it depends. It depends on the context. It depends on the students, the level of the students, and the pedagogical problem, I guess, that you as an instructor is trying to solve.
And like I mentioned earlier, with D2L and probably other LMSs, you can award badges, but look within your own LMS and see what can you use in a way that would bring a gamified element. I mean, you have in probably most LMSs like D2L, you can put students into groups. You can assign them to groups. So you could go ahead and bring that in. You have badges, and there's probably other things that you could create. We've used tokens in our courses so that students could kind of earn tokens and go back and redo assignments. Jeff, anything else to add?
Yeah, I think Arthur has touched on a lot of things. And even if you want to bring in like a fun element to assessment, there are things like Kahoot. There are systems like Badger, or Credly. Badger is actually one that we use as part of our LMS that you can award badges and things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a digital tool or anything that's online, but just I'm just reminded of another good example of using gamification. And one of the things about gamifying is some people like to have some kind of identity or things. And so, if you are doing something digital, allowing them to create an avatar or have some agency in what goes on. There's a professor on campus, A.B. Osborne, who their students, I think they design their own monetary unit. And so throughout the course for different activities, they're awarded this money for different things, and they're allowed to cash it in on whether it be maybe extra credit, or they're allowed to go last for a presentation or something like that. But it was a way for everybody to become involved in the creation and the creation of the content, and then an engaging way to reward them for some proficiency in certain things throughout the year, and then be able to use that reward. So those are kind of ways to use gamified elements. And it was not very technology heavy. It was a thing that didn't rely on any kind of platform, and was something that they could all design together on their own.
So it doesn't have to be complex. Look around for simple tools that you already have at your fingertips that you can use.
And it doesn't need to be digital technology, right? So I'll bring this example again, but starting from or using the learner-centered approach. So again, my public speaking course last semester, I noticed that students were not asking questions to the guest speaker, right? So this semester, by implementing this game-like element of just bringing in goodies for the students, but in the shape of a mystery bag, like what am I gonna pull out of this, right? That increased engagement. And same way with the booster, right? Last semester, I didn't have students really going to the Center for Writing Excellence a whole lot. And my hope is that this semester they will use the services, because that will be helpful to them. And it shows that students are also putting in the effort into their speech, and not just writing that speech like the day before it is due, right? So my hope is that by implementing this booster, this game-like element, that students will use those services more often. And I guess another example too is from that biology professor, right? Because she came to us with the issue of, this biology course, there's a lot of content that we need to teach students, and it is kind of dry content, especially if students are just required to take that specific course. So she's coming from that perspective, right? How can I help my students learn? And perhaps gamification could be the answer. Right, so that is the approach that we would encourage faculty or any educator to use when they're thinking of implementing any technology or any game-like element into their courses.
I'm reminded of another example, when Arthur was talking about content that perhaps is dry or a little hard to get a hold of. We worked with Dr. Dan Kamenstein, who actually has been a guest on the podcast. But for, I think it was World Professional Education Day, he would lecture on how different government organizations would work together in the event of a pandemic, because something like that would never happen. But instead of lecturing on how these groups work together, we worked with him to develop a game where these students were actually put into different groups where they were either FEMA or the WHO, but then had to learn how to work together in order to address and put their resources together in order to build things like nursing training stations and how to respond during a pandemic. And so it was a different way to engage with the content that, instead of just kind of hearing it one way and maybe seeing it on a slideshow, they were actually performing, and it was just a good example of increased engagement and having just a kind of a better understanding, and in a fun way. They were in a race against time, and they had to learn how to work together, and some had more resources than others, and so they had to actually go out and find somebody who might have more money than they did, or more clout than they did, or more power than they did, all in order to put their resources together to build these things. But it's another example of how you can take content that maybe is a little dry or doesn't necessarily connect well with the students, and by adding those game elements of being social, adding things like chance, the timer that kind of creates different stakes, it can make that content more engaging.
So, Arthur, what's in the mystery bag?
Well, so I have some chocolate, candy bars, some chips, and then some. I just went to a dollar store and got a bunch of stuff there.
Are we talking about Reese's?
Hershey's and Reese's.
Oh, okay. All right.
And so, so students can just pull an edible thing or not.
Yeah, whatever you can find.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, let's take a break. We'll come back with our continuing the conversation question.
Got a teaching idea worth sharing? Share it on AU Teaching Commons. We are Augusta University's first peer-reviewed hub of open teaching resources by faculty for faculty. Share your knowledge, help your peers, impact students. Visit us at guides.augusta.edu/AU Teaching Commons.
Welcome back. Let's ask our continuing the conversation question, which is, what advice would you give faculty members who are interested in incorporating gamification into their courses, but they're not sure where to start? Jeff?
Well, I think there are a lot of online resources that they can find that tell you about gamification principles and how to incorporate them. I'll give a shout out to a group, Sentencia, that can be found at sentenciagamification.com, and they have a lot of good resources on incorporating gamification, and they even offer different levels of certification on gamification and game-based learning. So that would also be a really, really good resource. And contacting CII if you're an Augusta University faculty member and asking for a consultation and having us work on a project with you can be a good way to start.
Anything to add, Arthur?
Well, the only thing I would say, as I said before, Richard Mayer is one of the authors that I simply love to read. And he does have some books on gamification. And he's the editor of the Handbook of Game-Based Learning. So this one was published, I think, was 2022. So those are good resources if faculty or any educator or instructional designer would like to learn more about game-based learning.
All right. And we can link some of that on our show page and the resources for this episode. All right, guys. Thanks. It's been a hoot. The conversation continues on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AUGCII. Please contribute your thoughts on today's topic and other episodes. You can find more on our show page at augusta.edu/innovation. Please take a moment to rate, review, subscribe, and share this podcast. We release new episodes the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semesters. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.